So last year, there was a lot of speculation about what cases would be decided by the court and how those cases would come out, considering the makeup of the court. But what nobody could have predicted was the death of Justice Antonin Scalia, who was one of the most consistent, reliable, and vocal conservative voices on the court. So with his passing, that set up some procedural and logistical issues that really shaped the outcome of a lot of the cases this term. The reason that his death had such an effect was primarily because the Senate refused to consider or even confirm any nominee by President Obama until there was a new president, which meant that the court would move forward with 8 justices. And the court can move forward with eight justices. That in itself isn't a problem. The problem is having 8 justices with 4 who are generally conservative and 4 who are generally liberal, that really increases the chances that you'll have an evenly divided court. You'll have a 4-4 split in cases. And when there's a 4-4 split, you have what's called affirmance by an equally divided court. And what that means is that the lower court opinion is left in place. Right? But it doesn't have the precedential value of a Supreme Court opinion, meaning that it's as if the Supreme Court never ruled on the case at all. And that means that the issue hasn't been decided. So the court could take up the issue in future years when there are a full 9 justices, but in the meantime, the issue is left unresolved for the states and for the lower courts. And so there was some concern when it became clear that they would have to proceed with only 8 justices, that the court might find some procedural or jurisdictional reasons to send back some of the more high-profile cases and not decide them and not have one of these 4-4 affirmances, but instead send it back and wait for another case to come up when there are a full 9 justices. In most cases, that didn't happen. There were a few high-profile cases where the court did split 4-4, and there was an affirmance by an equally divided court. And there were some where there was an unexpected majority, and so the case was actually decided on the merits. And there was one that, interestingly, the court did take the approach not necessarily to send it back on jurisdictional grounds, but instead to find a way to send it back without deciding the case. So there was one case where the court did actually send it back without deciding, and that was the case where there were several nonprofits, and mostly religious nonprofits, where they objected to the Obama administration's workaround in the Affordable Care Act for those organizations that did not want to provide contraception coverage for their employees. And the administration essentially said, you have to notify us, or you have to take some steps to let us know that you're not going to cover those employees. And the organization said, that's still a burden on our religious freedoms. And so the court rather than rule one way or the other, or rather than send it back with a 4-4 affirmance with an even split, the court actually asked for additional briefing, essentially saying to the parties, well, what if the government did this? Would that allay your concerns about religious freedom? And there was enough buy-in by the parties that the court said, well, we're going to vacate all of these conflicting lower court opinions and send it back to see if the parties can accept this proposed plan. And if so, we won't have to decide it. So essentially, in what is unusual and in some would say inappropriate, the court didn't decide the issue and instead sent it back with a suggestion, a very strong suggestion about how the parties might work it out, while giving some hints about what the court might do when the case comes back. So that's one where I think Justice Scalia's death clearly impacted how the court resolved the case. There were also a couple of high-profile cases where there was, in fact, a 4-4 split and affirmance by an evenly divided court, and therefore no precedential value. One was an important union case, the Friedrichs case. So it's well accepted that unions can't charge non-union members fees associated with political activities. However, this case challenged unions assessing what are called agency or fair share fees, which represent the cost to the union for things like collective bargaining. And there were those who said, we shouldn't have to pay for that if we object to the unions. And this is a case that was argued in January before Justice Scalia's death, and he participated. And based on his prior cases and the questions that were asked during the oral argument, there was general consensus that the unions would probably lose. This would be a 5-4 decision against the unions. With Justice Scalia's death, there was a 4-4 split. It was affirmed it was affirmed by an equally divided court and left in place a lower court decision upholding the fees. So in that case, the 4-4 split was a win for the unions. In another case, the United States versus Texas case, this is the one that involved challenges by multiple states of President Obama's executive action on immigration. And that was a case, again, where there was expected to be a 5-4 win for the states against the administration. It was decided by a 4-4 split, so affirmance by an equally divided court, which left in place a lower court injunction preventing implementation of President Obama's executive action. So in that case, the 4-4 split went against the administration and those who were looking for some form of immigration relief. So those were cases or examples of some of the higher profile cases where Justice Scalia's absence and the absence of a ninth justice resulted in a 4-4 split and left the ultimate issue unresolved and perhaps to be taken up by the court in future years when there is a full 9 justices. Aside from those cases, there were actually some surprises where there was some fear that there would be a 4-4 split, and the court was actually able to reach a majority decision in the case. So one high-profile case where there was a surprising result was University of Texas versus Fisher, and that was a case where the plaintiff was challenging the affirmative action program in place by the University of Texas. Now, in that case, which had been before the court before, the question was whether the program that was instituted by the University of Texas, where race was a factor, although not a determining factor, whether that program was in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And that was a case where Justice Kagan had recused herself because she was involved in one of the briefs that was filed in one of the lower court cases, and so she recused herself. So even before Justice Scalia's death, it was expected to be decided by 8 justices, with the 4 or the 5 conservative justices having a pretty comfortable majority. After Justice Scalia's passing, there were 7 justices, but the conventional wisdom was that this is a case where the affirmative action program was likely to be struck down. Well, in a surprise, Justice Kennedy actually voted to uphold the program. Now, this is the first time in his 28 years that he's ever upheld an affirmative action program. And so rather than a 4-3 vote against the program, which was expected, there was a 4-3 vote upholding the program. Although it was on some rather narrow grounds, and Justice Kennedy was very careful to point out that this is very fact-intensive and the university should continue reevaluating the program as it goes on, it was a surprising and big win for affirmative action programs across the country. In another rather surprising to many case, the Whole Women's Health versus the Whole Women's Health case, which was a case challenging Texas statutes that impose severe restrictions on abortion clinics in Texas, Justice Kennedy voted with the 4 liberal justices in an opinion that Justice Breyer wrote that held that these restrictions posed an undue burden on women seeking access to abortion services. That was a huge victory for abortion advocates because there are similar statutes in place in many states, and this has been in prior years, states have been enacting these statutes that were directed, the states were arguing that they were designed to protect women's health. So there were requirements that abortion providers have admitting privileges to certain hospitals, and that the clinics where abortions were provided have to meet certain requirements that were just too burdensome, too expensive, or too onerous for a lot of the abortion providers and clinics. And so it would have meant that the vast majority of clinics would shut down. There would only be a handful left in the state of Texas to serve millions of women. And so if those statutes had been upheld, it would have been a big victory for those who, depending on how how you view it. Either we're intending to shut down abortion clinics or to make it so burdensome that they would be unavailable for a lot of people. Although the states were arguing we're just trying to protect women's health. Essentially, Justice Breyer said these statutes are not intended to protect women's health. There wasn't enough evidence that there was actually a problem to be solved, and that these regulations would help anybody, that they would do anything to reduce the already very low rates of complications for abortions. And so essentially the majority said, yes, you can have regulations seeking to protect women, but not if they have the purpose and effect of imposing an undue burden on women who want access to abortion services. So it was an important victory because for abortion advocates, because it meant that there is still some teeth to this undue burden standard that came along in Planned Parenthood versus Casey's a couple decades ago, and that had been used or hadn't really been fleshed out, and it wasn't clear whether the Supreme Court or how the Supreme Court was going to apply that test, and whether it would mean not the eradication of abortion in the United States, but severely limiting access to a lot of women. So that was a case where at best they thought they were going to have a 4-4 split, and instead there was a win. There was an actual majority opinion that has some binding effect, that has the effect of Supreme Court, the weight of the Supreme Court opinion, and that will have a huge effect in many states. So Justice Scalia's death was undoubtedly a large factor in how cases were decided over this term, but in some cases where a lot of people thought it would have a huge impact, it didn't, and in others where the more conservative justices were expected to have a majority and win, they were unable to win because their majority was gone.